Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. My name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. That guy over there is Vince Adair. He's our football analyst. And Vince, you were texting me like about a half an hour ago, like this is going to be a fun show because you've been watching a lot of North Carolina offensive film.
That's correct.
And this is the matchup that I think everyone's most interested in seeing. I think that the Notre Dame offense against the Notre Dame defense might be the most important to victory, but that's because of how good I think this North Carolina offense can be. Now, it's been a very inconsistent group this year, far more inconsistent than it was last year. I don't think it's as talented as it was last year at various positions. But I'm even more worried about this offense than I was last year's offense, Vince, for a number of reasons that I'm going to explain as we dive into this. But the biggest one for me is Sam Howell is a lot better this year than he was last year.
Okay.
And that's as a passer and as a runner. To me, that right there, sort of big picture, and I'm bringing this up now because it's going to impact all three of the next categories we're going to talk about.
Absolutely.
He, to me, last year was a good quarterback that was a product of having great players around him. This year, he's a quarterback that has shown me to be capable of putting an offense on the shoulders. And his run-throw ability this season, to me, makes him very dangerous, and that is something that has given this Notre Dame offense problems or defense problems.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say that he's your prototypical dual threat quarterback, but he's very effective when he runs the ball.
He is a passing quarterback that can run.
Yes, right. Absolutely. And he seems to run. They do have called runs for him. Obviously, they do some draw stuff. They do a little bit of quarterback power, short yardage type situations. But he kind of reminds me a little bit of Notre Dame's quarterback last year in that
as a runner.
Let's
make sure we're real clear on that.
Very clear on that. In that, when he sees a crease, when he drops back to pass, he is going to take it.
Yeah.
He's going to go because I don't think he 100% trusts his offensive line. So if he sees an area to go, he's going to go. And he's very effective, and he is not willing, for the most part, to slide. He's going to take on tacklers, and he's shifty. He's like deceivingly shifty. When he runs the ball too,
which is why I think that book comparison athletically is really is a good one.
Yeah,
and we'll dive into how and we'll dive into how his athleticism has made them better than last year's offense in some areas. But this matchup for me, Vince, is concerning because this is a potent North Carolina offense. It's like I said, it's inconsistent. You don't know which one's gonna show up. The one thing I think that's good for Notre Dame is as you watch that film and you watch this year's film and last year's film and you look at this offense and you think about how good it's been, there's been a theme the last 2 years with one exception as to when this offense really looks good, and that has been mainly when they've been at home.
Yeah.
North Carolina has not been a great road team. Now, I think a lot of people don't realize that because a lot of people didn't really – a lot of Notre Dame fans especially, but a lot of college football fans, I feel like last year the only time they really paid attention to North Carolina was late in the year against Notre Dame, and then in the postseason late in the season when they pounded Miami. And I think that's where a lot of the hype came from. They watched that Miami game when they ran for over 500 yards and had almost 800 yards of offense, hung 62 on Miami at Miami, and then give Texas A&M a decent game and a bowl game without a bunch of their best players. And so I think that's why there was a lot of hype about this team coming into the season. This team has not been as explosive as last year's team. It's not as dynamic on a yards per play basis, but to me it's more dangerous because I think this unit matches up better against Notre Dame's defense than it did last year. And that's what I'm referring to when it's more dangerous. Not that it's better than last year's unit overall. It's not. Sure. It's better in a couple areas that then lead me to the matchup specifically against Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest concern. So Vince, let's dive into this matchup. And we're going to start with, as we always do, the run game.
Yes.
The Notre Dame rush defense against the North Carolina rush offense. This is one of those areas, Vince, when I look at North Carolina, I'm talking about difference between this year and last year's team. They're not close to being the rushing team this year that they were last year. Last year, they were a really, really dynamic group. Obviously, you had 2 running backs went over 1,000 yards. Javonte Williams, the second-round pick of the Broncos, who the Broncos aren't playing enough this year, by the way, was their low man in yards per carry last year at 7.3. Right, and Michael Carter was at 7.98. Both went for at least 1,100 yards, despite skipping the bowl game. They were a dynamic group that averaged 235 yards per game. They averaged 5.8 yards per carry. This group isn't that dynamic. You look at Ty Chandler, their leading rusher, has 588 yards. He's barely on. I mean, I think he's on pace for 1,000 if you include the postseason, but not real dynamic. The 2 big differences this year is their run game has been more, has been less dynamic, but it's to me, for when I look at the Notre Dame matchup, Vince, it's more concerning because last year the running backs did the running. Sam Howell last season in 12 games had 146 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. This year in 7 games, he has 494 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. He was at 1.6 yards per carry last year. He's at 5.2 this year. If you look at how Notre Dame has played this season, what are the things that have given Notre Dame problems this year? Mobile quarterbacks. Jordan Travis put 38 on Notre Dame. Notre Dame had trouble stopping Braxton Burmeister, right, as a dual threat guy. That makes Sam Howell, to me, this season a far more dangerous player against Notre Dame than he was last season.
Yeah, and I'm wondering what is going through his head, when he decides to run the way that he does. Like, is it because he doesn't trust his receivers the way he did last year? Is it because he doesn't trust his O-line? Or is it just because, look, I'm a good runner, I'm going to get out there and I'm going to run? And I think you could make a case for all 3, or maybe a little bit of a combination of all 3. But he escapes the pocket quicker this year than he did last year, and with an eye to run.
I think it's needed. I think that's the reason
I do
why.
too, and I agree with you. Watching this team, the number 11, right, Downs. Obviously, they want to throw to him. I get that. The rest of the guys haven't been as productive as he's had in the past, right? So he wants to run the ball, and I get it. And I'll tell you, because we're talking about the run game, obviously, the Jones kid, I think he runs the ball hard. Like he runs the ball very, very hard. 26, I think, is his number.
Yeah.
I watching him run the ball. Notre Dame is going to have to get after it. He falls forward.
He doesn't really play a lot, though. I mean,
the game that I watched the Florida State game today,
right?
And he was the primary
only
back.
game. I mean, that was a good game. I mean, he went for 11 for 60 for that game, but he went 12 for 27 against Miami. Those are the only 2 times this year he's really carried it more than 10 times, and I think that right there is a big reason why. I mean, look, Ty Chandler's got 588 yards in 7 games.
Right.
He's had 2 100-yard games this year. Went for 198 against Virginia. Went for a $104 last week against Miami. I think a big reason, and then you look at Jones has on the season 167 yards. After that, their next top running back is Caleb Hood at 82 yards.
Right.
I think a big reason why Sam Howell's been such a bigger part of the run game this season, and you, as you mentioned, they'll do some calls for him. It's not a lot of calls. It's
right.
Just kind of like enough to keep you honest.
Yeah.
A lot of his stuff is off scrambles, and that kind of, to me, adds to the danger. Like, you almost need to talk about that in more of the pass game than you do the run game.
Yeah.
But I think if you take scrambles away from what he does, it's not a real super potent run game. And to me, this is the area that Notre Dame has to dominate, in my opinion, Vince.
Exactly.
Because they don't have Michael Carter. They don't have Javonte Williams. And you mentioned DJ Jones. He does run hard. And he brings some size to the table. He's listed at 205. He runs hard. Like you said, he's a physical kid. He'll put his shoulder down. But he's not a kid that necessarily scares me if I'm Notre Dame. I think what makes me, when I look at Notre Dame and North Carolina, this matchup, for me, it's all going to be about the line when it comes to just the pure run game. And when I watch North Carolina's line, it's funny, they got 5 starters coming back from last year, but they're not as good as they were last year, in my opinion. And then and part of it is because that's how good the backs were last year.
Sure. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
this line, I mean, they're not a real physical line, even though they've got good size, and they get whooped. I mean, they get whooped a lot. I mean, and that's going to be a key for Notre Dame. And that's why I'm a little nervous about Notre Dame going to a 3-down front again this week, because I feel like you're playing right into North Carolina's hands by playing a 3-down front, because they are slow developing, counters, kind of get double teams against these teams. Teams that play 3-man fronts have gotten kind of gashed by North Carolina. Teams that have gone to more aggressive fronts like Florida State did. Florida State stayed in their 4-man and they attacked North Carolina. And yeah, they gave up some big plays, but they also made a lot of plays against North Carolina. And so to me, that's where I'm most nervous, is I'm afraid that Notre Dame is going to go to more of a 3-man front using Isaiah Foskey to drop into coverage.
Yes.
And while that worked against USC, I have a lot of doubts about whether or not it's going to work as effectively against North Carolina. And it's because North Carolina is a far more committed to the run game football team.
Yeah, I concerning the offensive line and watching them play, the Florida State line or defensive line gave them fits, and they were playing games the whole time. And North Carolina didn't do a very good job of picking it up, to be honest with you. And I would say North Carolina's offensive line is average. They didn't do anything to make me say, wow, these guys are really good, but they didn't do anything to make me say, wow, that's Notre Dame at the beginning of the season.
Right.
They're average, right? They at times they have a good pocket, but at times they could be pushed back into Sam Howell too. And so they're a little light in the pants, it feels like, up the middle. And so I feel like that's an area where Notre Dame could dominate. And again, if you can play some games with them, like if they're going to go to a 3 front, you still need to bring 4 every time. And you need to bring 4 from different angles and different spots. And that's fine if you're going to do that. But again, I'd still like to see Isaiah Foskey on the line as an end in that 3 front, not as a linebacker in that 3 front, right? I mean, that's what I would like to see. Let him get after the quarterback on a consistent basis. And I think good things will happen. So if they do that, I don't have a problem with the 3 front. I really don't. But again, you need to bring 4 and 5-man pressures at times from different areas.
And that's my thing is I don't care how they line up. They got to bring more guys to attack the line. You can't attack the line with 3 a lot. And you look at that North Carolina game and the Florida State game, and this is how sometimes numbers can be deceiving. North Carolina ran for 229 yards against Florida State. So you're like, well, okay, you're talking about how you should do what Florida State did. Well, that was North Carolina's second best rushing game of the season. But if you watch that game, a lot of their yards came from Sam Howell scrambles, because Florida State's aggressiveness got him out of rhythm all game long. Sam Howell went 17 of 32, had his second lowest completion percentage of the season, the lowest being Virginia Tech, and went for only 203 yards in that game. Right. And Miami also did a lot of 4-man fronts against them and had success. Virginia Tech did a decent amount of that and had success. So to me, that's kind of been the blueprint, is whether it's 3 or 4 down, it's more about attacking. Teams that attack the North Carolina line for 60 minutes are the ones that have given North Carolina problems and have been able to keep their points down. Now, Miami couldn't keep points down because Miami sucks, and because Miami gave North Carolina some short fields and gave up some big plays. North Carolina had a 12-yard scoring drive against Miami, a 21-yard scoring drive against Miami. Those things helped. They gave up big plays, but they were able to limit the pass game more effectively. And they did. To me, Notre Dame's going to have to do that, but they're going to have to do it with the front. And that's going to be the big key, because if this is about coverage, you're going to have some problem in this game.
Agreed. And I wanted – we were talking about, Sam Howell running the football. Steve says Sam Howell isn't really a burner, though, is he? No, he's not a burner, but you
don't got to be a burner to move the chains, and that's the whole point.
That's exactly my point. He will move the chains for you. He can wiggle enough to get out of some things and move the chains. And look, that's all you need to do to extend drives, right? So he's absolutely good enough to do that, and he's good enough to move the. Here's what I would say: he's good enough to move the chains. Plus, like he's athletic. He can run. He's not going to outrun your entire defense. He's not going to do that. But he can make some plays, and if you turn your back on him and man coverage, he'll make you pay for it.
Yeah.
Right. So he's a move the chains plus runner, in my opinion. And
it's
again,
those
it's mostly
plays that then
scrambles.
set up the big plays in other
Yes.
instances. Those
Absolutely.
chain moving plays are what allow them to extend the offense and then make those other plays. And that's the key.
Yes.
But
Nailed
this
it.
breakdown ultimately Vince comes down to Notre Dame has to dominate up front.
Yeah.
However they do it, they've got to dominate up front. And that's going to be the key. And if you look at every single game that North Carolina's offense has struggled this year, it's been because Sam Howell has never been able to get into the rhythm.
Right.
Whether it's Virginia Tech, whether it's Florida State, whether it's Georgia Tech, Virginia could not put any pressure on him, and he shredded them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's the big thing. And that's one thing that Miami at times was able to kind of rattle him, but at other times couldn't get on him and he could make big plays. So that to me is the key, is you've got to put pressure on Sam Howell. And part of putting pressure on Sam Howell is getting him in second and third and long situations. And in order to talk about their run game, we kind of got to talk about the RPO. So what I want to do, Vince, is I want to transition to the pass game a little bit earlier than normally we would, because there's going to be some bleeding over in this regard. So Vince, let's dive into the pass game now. And I wanted to get a couple super chats here that are relevant, and I wanted to hold off on them until we got to the pass game.
Yes.
We had one from John A1 that says, thank you for the super chat, John. He said, UNC receivers have speed. Notre Dame is going to need Tariq Bracy to have his best game against the team that crushed him last year. That is something, and that's a really interesting thing, because this is the game where they went after him early, beat him, and got in his head. They're going to go after him again.
Absolutely. I would.
And the thing about this game is, Tariq's in the slot this year. Well, Josh Downs is going to play in the slot.
And he's the most dynamic wide receiver.
I would say he's the most dynamic receiver they've played all year so far.
Yeah,
I would
agree.
make that case. He's a really, really, really good player. And then, we're going to dive into that here in a second. Then Patrick Barnes with a super chat. Thank you, Patrick. Since there was a change in D coordinators for Notre Dame, do you think they will apply what worked last year on defense to this year? I don't think so, because I think this is a different offense and a different defense. The personnel is different this year than it was last year on both sides of the ball. I also think that last year, Notre Dame went into a game plan thinking they were going to have Kyle Hamilton, and North Carolina thought they were going to have Kyle Hamilton. And I keep telling folks, 15, 20 minutes at halftime doesn't give you enough time to completely change your game plan in a way that will allow you to attack Notre Dame without Kyle Hamilton. You can do some things, right? But it's different when you have a whole week to prepare.
Right.
And so North Carolina's not the team they were last year. You can't defend them the way that you did last year, because you're then playing into what you're trying to take away certain things that maybe they're better at this year, or focusing on things they're not as good at this year. And Notre Dame is better in some areas than they were last year, not as good as some. I mean, you don't have a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah that you can use as sort of a Swiss Army knife. There's things Notre Dame did last year defensively because they had Kyle Hamilton and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah on the field, and they can't do that this year. So I don't know how much last year's game plan is going to necessarily help you. I do think there's some foundational principles that you can carry over from last year, and the biggest one being controlling the line of scrimmage. And that's what Notre Dame did against North Carolina last year, Vince. They harassed Sam Howell the first couple series, he was getting the ball out quick, and they went right down the field twice against Notre Dame and scored. But then after that, Notre Dame started really harassing him, dominating line of scrimmage, getting in his face, and he wasn't as effective. And last year's pass offense was far more explosive than this year's pass offense, just overall. But I would say that Notre Dame, I think Notre Dame with Kyle Hamilton, with Nick McLeod, they matched up pretty well with North Carolina last year. And also Notre Dame had big physical ends last year that could control the run game. I think that's an area we can look at this year's team and say, hey, you've got some big physical ends this year too. There's some carryover there with Myron Tungavaloa, but this is a team that doesn't line up the same way that last year's defense did. They just, whether we like it or not, they just don't. They don't play the four-man fronts the way that last year's team did. So you really can't look at it that way. I think the foundational principles of take away the quicks as much as possible without completely making yourself vulnerable to the deep game, and then you have to attack Sam Howell, because here's the thing. We talked about how Sam Howell's a good runner, and he can make you pay with his legs. what's made him so good this year more than anything is he, in my opinion, is one of the 2 or 3 best deep ball throwers in all of college football. And they throw the ball deep a ton, and he's really good at it. And they have a lot of speed. The other thing that they're really good at, Vince, and this is the big one for me, they already are a team that formationally and schematically wants to attack your safeties and linebackers with the pass game. That's just what they do anyway. And you're looking against a Notre Dame team that's linebackers haven't been great against the pass this year and who are playing without an All-American safety. That has me a little nervous about this matchup on Saturday night.
And it should. I mean, it should have you nervous. It's got me nervous and it should have everybody nervous because those are right now going into this game weaknesses in the pass game for Notre Dame. But the flip side of that, and you kind of mentioned it, was Sam Howell is not good at throwing the football when he's getting pressured. He tends to throw
a lot of mistakes.
He tends to throw off of his back foot. He tends to try to force some things that shouldn't be forced. He should just eat it and take the sack or throw it away or whatever the case may be. There was one play in the Florida State game where the center, I want to say, got pushed all the way back into him. He tried to throw a deep ball, but ended up being short and got picked off because he had to throw off of his back foot. Look, no quarterback is going to be able to get as much mustard on a ball that they want if they're throwing off their back foot like that. And his fundamentals break down when he's got pressure. He doesn't step into things when he knows he's about to get hit. That's what I've noticed. And so that would be a knock on Sam Howell. Again, I'm finding chinks in armor that, he's a really good quarterback. Okay. But if you want to defeat him, if you want to get in his head, you've got to put pressure on him. And then that's going to take pressure off of your linebackers and your secondary, et cetera. So, I mean, really this game just very much comes down to what the front is able to do to Sam Howell.
Yeah, because look, Sam Howell's a really good college football player.
Absolutely.
He's much better this year than he was last year.
Yes.
But I also don't think he's a top 5 NFL quarterback that some people make him out to be too. And a big reason why I don't think that is because I don't think he's a super accurate quarterback, Vince. His ball placement is not great.
Yep.
He plays in a system that's good for his skills. It's perfect system for his talent. He's really good at throwing the ball downfield. He can get the ball out quickly. They run a ton of RPOs.
Yes, they do.
And that to me is the area where I'm most concerned. And it's those RPOs inherently, and they're a true air raid passing team. Now, they're not a true air raid offense like Lincoln, like we see at USC and Washington State, meaning they only throw. What I'm referring to is their air raid, their pass game is air raid principles through and through, which means they're not just running RPOs that are slants and hitches and bubble screens. They're doing those things. That's obviously a part of an air raid, and they'll do those quick games. But they are going to run RPOs that get you the ball downfield. They're going to ride your line, and if your linebackers come up, they're throwing post routes as part of their RPOs. And that's going to put like Josh Downs, it's going to put Antoine Green, it's going to put their players in matchups against DJ Brown and Houston Griffith. And I'm going to be honest with you, that's a matchup that concerns me. And the reason it concerns me more this year than last year, even though I don't think their offensive weapons are as good as they were last year. Now, Josh Downs is every bit as good, in my opinion, as what De'Ami Brown was last year.
Agreed.
And he's even scarier because I think he scares me more after the catch. I mean, Josh Downs has had several plays where he's either caught like a 5-yard hitch or, he had a score, I think it was against Virginia. He catches like a little 5-yard hitch route in space, makes like 3 guys miss, and then bam, he's off for a 60-yard touchdown. He can turn slants into big plays. He can turn, and then he can stretch the field. And he had a touchdown against Virginia. There was a long corner where he extends. I mean, he's having a great year. But after him, there isn't a Daz Newsome like they had last year. There isn't that second and third. The running backs make plays in the pass game, but they don't make plays in the pass game like the kids last year. I mean, you look at right now, Josh Downs has 60 catches for 837 yards. Their next best guy is 11 catches for 253 yards. Whereas last year, they had Daz Newsome, and then you had Coffrey Brown, who recently transferred. He couldn't stay healthy, couldn't transfer. But then you had the running backs combined for 50 catches. The running backs this year in 7 games have combined for 15 catches.
Yeah.
So it's a different offense. And Josh Downs is the focal point of that offense. And like USC with Drake Bowen, they're going to move him all around the field. Now, he's not a guy that's going to be playing a ton of the boundary, right? And doing those things because he's a smaller guy. He's like 5'10", 5'11".
Yeah, he's a little guy. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's super dynamic. And
Yeah.
that's where the RPO game concerns me a little bit. And that's why it's, again, I'm going to go back to, it's so important that the defensive line plays great, because if you can dominate the trenches, then the linebackers can read and react a little bit more, meaning and this is what worked so well last year, Vince. The defensive line would just blow North Carolina off the ball. And that would force Sam Howell to make quicker decisions with his give and his pulls in the RPO game, right? So if he was going to give, he had to give now because the line was getting blown up. And that forced the running backs to declare, which then allowed the linebackers to flow hard to the ball, okay? And it also did the same thing in the RPOs. He had to kind of pull quickly and throw, which meant the linebackers could kind of stay back. The safeties didn't have to come down as hard. And it allowed Notre Dame to be more effective defending those type of throws. And so they could just kind of get the ball out quick and tackle in space and those kind of things, which is going to be a huge part of this game, tackling in space. But if you don't get pressure and he can ride those RPOs and effectively execute, because the other thing is that they do a lot of play action also, like pure play action. It looks like RPOs, but it's actually play action. That makes that defense, that makes that offense really hard to defend if you can't win at the line.
Right.
And that's, again, another reason why you have to win at the line of scrimmage in this matchup.
Could not agree more. And you can't allow a quarterback like Sam Howell, regardless if we think he's a top 5 draft pick or not. It doesn't matter. If he's able to sit back there and do whatever he wants to do, they're going to have success. I mean, they've got enough talent around him to have success. And you also have to make sure that you contain him when he just drops back to pass. Because, again, he's gonna want to run. He's gonna he does not trust his offensive line based on what I'm seeing on film. And if he sees a crease, he's gonna take it. And so you have to be ready for that. You have to either spy him or you have to not go upfield and leave that crease up the middle, right? You can't let him spin out like Ian Book always used to do, in the past, spin out and then, get yards on the outside. So you have to contain Sam Howell. If you keep him in the pocket and you close that pocket down where he's going to start feeling that pressure, that's when you can start to have success, and that's when you can start doing some other things defensively.
Now, this super chat from John Klimek, and John, thank you for sending that. But this, to me, hits on 2 points that we've discussed so far. Number one, he makes the point about containing the run and keeping Howell in the pocket, which is exactly what you were just talking about, Vince, right? Which is important. But he also talked about how, last year, this is a game where Maris Luafau was very involved from a pass rusher standpoint. Jeremiah Owusu was very involved from a pass rushing standpoint. I still remember the play where they almost got a safety where Notre Dame brings Foskey off the edge and brings, Owusu Kormo, who then jumps up and doesn't let Sam Howell get rid of the ball. Maris triggered a lot. Notre Dame doesn't have, at least they haven't so far this year, they haven't been a great blitzing team with their linebackers. They don't have the length at linebacker they had last year. They don't have, Notre Dame's linebackers can run. I think that's a misconception, but just because you can run doesn't mean you're a great blitzer.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe that can be Isaiah Pryor, but it sounds like Notre Dame wants to use Isaiah Pryor more at safety, which to me is another reason the injury to Kyle Hamilton hurt you, because this would have been a perfect game for me to have Isaiah Pryor playing in space, coming downhill on the screens and blitzing. And they can't, depending on based on what Brian Kelly said, it doesn't sound like they're going to have that as an option on Saturday. So it just to me, this is why you should have got Xavier Watts more ready to play earlier as a safety.
Right.
It's also why the recruiting of Terry Joseph has hurt you, because your safety depth chart right now is a hot mess. And so to me, this is a great super chat. And also it speaks to what we talked about earlier, Vince, which is why you just can't replicate last year's game plan and strategy against North Carolina, because neither team has the same players.
Yeah, and I think that you make a good point about Pryor being back at safety. I think he could have filled a similar role that they used Maris for last year. Like he's pretty good coming off the edge. He tackles in space, and that's we've talked about this a bunch of times. That's what he's good at, and so far Notre Dame has put him in position to be good and to use his abilities to benefit this defense. Putting him back at safety scares the what out of me, because that's not putting him in a position to be successful, in my opinion. Depending Again, we talked about this yesterday a little bit, I think. But depending on how they use him as a safety, if they're going to do 3 safeties and they're going to kind of keep him a little closer to the line of scrimmage, we can have that conversation. But I could see him being much more effective, in the box, rushing the outside, being a 4th or 5th man coming down, and trying to penetrate that line. I think that could be a very beneficial way to use him. But we'll see how that ends up happening.
I think this year, defending North Carolina's pass game, and we've already talked about the need to put pressure on the quarterback. And as you can kind of see down here at the bottom, right? This is not something North Carolina is very good at.
Exactly.
Like really good, pretty good, really good, great, really good. And then down here, you kind of get into some of these havoc things. That's why, this right here is a big reason for these 2 things right here. And that would be
correct.
They rank 127th out of 130 teams in sacks. They've allowed 27 sacks in 7 games. And it's not just about sacks. They allow a lot of pressure on the quarterback, which leads to them ranking 73rd in completion percentage and leads to them ranking 67th in interceptions. And so to me, that is something that is a big factor in this as well. I mean, last year, Sam Howell completed 68.1% of his passes. He threw 7 interceptions in 12 games. And he's thrown 6 already this year. Because as you said, Vince, as you pointed out earlier, when he gets pressured, his footwork goes out the window. He'll rush throws, and he'll throw the ball up, and you can get it. And that's why the defensive line. I've got a midweek musing is gonna come out after our show today.
Nice.
And I talk about just the, like when I first started kind of covering the team from like 2007 to 2009 before I was doing it full time. And then when I started doing it full time in 2010, one of the myths out there, and it was considered a truth at the time, was that, Notre Dame can't recruit and develop top level offensive linemen. It's the same excuses people use about certain positions now. They just, those kids don't want to go to school. They don't, blah, 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 blah. And, then there was times during the early BK tenure where they'd get some recruits here and there. You had Stephon Tuitt and Lewis Nix, and you had Sheldon Day and some guys like that, but never the consistency or the depth or that you really needed. But man, Mike Elson has just completely destroyed that myth. And, it's like, we lost 2 defensive ends of the NFL. No problem. We got this. That's kind of, how Mike Elson is, like, we lost Julian Aguara and Khalid Kareem. No problem. I got Dalen Hayes and Adi Ogundiji. Oh, okay, those guys are now in the NFL. No worries. I got Myron Tungvalo and Isaiah Foskey, and just keeps just replenishing it over and over and over again. And the Notre Dame defensive line through 7 games is on pace to have the most tackles for loss, and most sacks of the Brian Kelly era for defensive line. And that's, I mean, when you consider the kind of lines they've had, that's pretty good. They have to be at their best in this game.
Yes.
I mean, and that's why I kind of wrote that article today, because it's the appropriate time today, because they've been the team's best unit so far this season, in my opinion. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, Vince. They're
from
the
top
best
to bottom,
unit,
absolutely.
For Notre Dame.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have to be at their best in this game. Have to be.
They have to show why they're the best unit on the
absolutely,
on that side
and they have to be at their best today.
Right.
Real quick, we got Alberto from watching from sunny Spain. Keep up the great work. I love watching you guys. Alberto, you are the first person that's left us a super chat from Spain,
and I think the first person that's left us a Euro super chat.
Yes,
by the way,
yes,
which is great.
I'm like getting on my Euro to dollar converter right now, but I appreciate that so much. Thank you for being with us, Alberto. Really means a lot. Really means a lot, and I hope things are going well for you and everybody over there.
We had one from JP too, and I think we missed it early on, Brian. I want to make sure we pull it up.
My man JP Buellsfeld, is that who it was from?
Yep.
There we go. Okay,
yeah,
JP.
Absolutely. It says, go Irish, beat North Carolina. I'm honoring my pledge to Super Chat every single time I watch Irish Breakdown live.
JP, we appreciate that, but I want to release you from that pledge, because I don't want you what? I've given them a lot. It's 12:30. I got something else to do right now. I can't watch live. We release you from that pledge. We appreciate that very much, but I'd much rather you be here live than to be like, I've already given these guys enough money this month. I'm going to watch later. Okay. So but appreciate a lot. JP has been super supportive of our channel and of Irish Breakdown for months. He sends me emails. When my mom was sick, he sent me a personal email, just about her and checking on her. So JP, we love you. Appreciate that very,
big
very
time.
much. But Vince, back to what we were discussing, the D line
has
to dominate. That to me ultimately is the key in this game for Notre Dame. If they can play to the potential, they're going to have success. Here's the second key, and it's most important in the pass game. They have to tackle well in space, and that ultimately that's probably my biggest concern in this game, because if you miss Drake London, he was kind of a big guy. He could run. He was going to turn a.
He was slippery. I mean, he was slippery,
but he's not like a dynamic, explosive downfield guy. If you miss in space against Josh Downs the way that you did against Drake London and the way you did at times against Virginia Tech, they're not going to be 30, 40-yard gains. They're going to be 6 points. Right. And that's the concern for me. Same thing with the run game. If you and Sam Howell, if you tackle well in space, like somebody had mentioned earlier, one of our listeners, this is why I love our listeners, because I'm like, man, they're just making all these points I want to make, that are so good that we want to talk about. But like they talked about, the quarterback, one reason, like against Virginia Tech, for example, is an example. Florida State, we saw it. They lose contain. And then you'll have too many snaps where, as good as the defensive line has been, it's scary to think about what their numbers could be if they would not miss so often in the backfield as they've had. Those things can't happen in this game because the running backs at North Carolina aren't great. But what they do, Vince, is they're super patient. And if you're losing a tane, if there's no gap control, they'll wait and find that crease and hit it. And they'll pull a ball and throw RPOs. The big part of who they want to be is they are about space. Get their athletes in space.
And you have
to tackle. And that's one thing Notre Dame did. There was a couple times early. I remember Sean Crawford missed like a 3rd and 19 that allowed them to convert, and there was another missed tackle. But for the most part, and especially in the second half, Notre Dame tackled extremely well last year. And that's where DJ Brown and Houston Griffith had their biggest impact, is they did really good job. I still remember that one play. I remember watching events, and they ran like a little running back slide, and I'm like, uh-oh, I don't see anybody on the screen. And then all of a sudden, Houston comes out of nowhere and just drills them for like a 2-yard gain. We need to see that for 60 minutes on Saturday, because this is the most dangerous team they've played so far in regards to what they can do to you if you miss tackles. I think the only team we've seen that was maybe as good at them is Florida State, and we saw what happened in that game when Notre Dame made mistakes. This is a dynamic team, and even some of the receivers aren't great players. They're athletic, and they can hurt you if you don't tackle. And that's huge.
And I will say that North Carolina does a really good job of scheming to get their guys the ball in space. I mean, they'll run tunnel screens. They'll run running back screens. The RPO look like a screen, but it's an RPO. I mean, they will do what they need to do to get the ball in the hands of their playmakers. And it's scary at times.
I love that you said that, Vince. I want to interrupt you real quick, because I think the point you just made is great. I was actually going to make the opposite point. Yes, they'll do RPO screens, but they'll also call screens for their receivers, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But I think that dynamic is important, Vince, because you can't force them to not get the ball to Josh Downs. And that's the point. Because you could say, hey, we're going to take away those RPOs. But they'll find ways to get them. And I think that's so important. And so continue that breakdown. But I think that point is really good, that they're going to run play actions that look like RPOs. They're going to throw it. They're going to run RPO screens, but they will call screens as well, especially if you get a little too aggressive.
Yeah.
So finish your point about how good they are at scheming. Imagine this concept, right, Vince? Isn't this crazy? An offensive coaches scheming ways to get their playmakers the football in space.
Unbelievable, huh?
I mean, just rocket science.
Yep. They find ways to get 11 the football. Let's put it that way. They know that he's their biggest playmaker, and they're going to find a way to get him the football. And then if you take him away, they've got guys that can hurt you. I will say, from watching film, some of those other guys, right? I don't know that they rise to the occasion as much as they should. Seen some drops, some things of that nature. But the point is, they're open. and if they make those plays, they could be really, really dangerous. And so you have to be on your P's and Q's, and you can't forget about guys with the number 0 and guys with the number 3 and the tight ends. You can't forget about those guys because they can hurt you. But look, I mean, as you're looking at the number of receptions, Josh Downs has 60 catches on the season. The next closest is 16. Okay, it's a big drop off. And so it is, to a degree, if you can take away or limit Josh Downs, you're going to have success. But we said that last week about the USC kid, number 15, right? We said that about him, and they still allowed him to get 15 catches. And the issue with that is, and you mentioned it before, Downs will turn those into bigger plays. And that's what scares me a little bit about this particular matchup. I think that they can limit him, but he's so squirmy, and I mean that in the best way possible, right? He's going to get out of stuff, and if he breaks one tackle, he could outrun the rest, and that's the problem that I see there. And look, these wide receivers, these guys on the perimeter, they can block. We've seen them block. And the running backs can block for Sam Howell when they want to. So you just have to be careful. This team is much more balanced than USC was, and that's what worries me.
Right. We'll get to the next section, Vince. Well, let's talk about the North Carolina scoring offense against the Notre Dame scoring defense. And I want to pull up a super chat here. My guy Matt. Sometimes y'all kill me. Sometimes. Did y'all watch them play Virginia Tech? It looks like that is the second best overall defense UNC has seen. Notre Dame being number 1, they scored 10 against Virginia Tech. Okay, did you see what Notre Dame's defense did that weekend against one of the worst teams that they played? They gave up 38 points to North Carolina to Florida State. I think we can all agree that the first game of the season, after losing a 2,000-yard running backs and a 1,000-yard receiver and their number 2 receiver, focusing on the first game of the year isn't necessarily indicative of what they're going to be the entire season. This is game 8, right? Just like we can't expect Notre Dame's defense to look like it did against Florida State in the opener, right? It was replacing some guys, that kind of thing. I think there are principles that Notre Dame needs to take from that game, but you can't just say, well, Notre Dame's a better defense than Virginia Tech, therefore they should hold them to 10 or fewer points. North Carolina is a much better offense now than they were in the opener. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And that was a team that was playing their first game of the season. But at the same time, what did Virginia Tech do to win that game? They dominated the line of scrimmage on defense. That's the key. And so the principle applies, but I don't think it's so simple as just saying, well, hey, because A equals, this, B equals that, doesn't mean that those two things add up to C. Right? It just doesn't quite. You see, I'm like throwing like algebra and stuff, and I don't even understand my own references.
But there's one person in my house that understands math, and it's not me. So
So again, it just. And the other thing I'll say too is Virginia Tech, I would argue, has a little bit of a better secondary than what Notre Dame has right now because they don't have Houston Griffith.
Yeah.
I mean, excuse me, Kyle Hamilton.
Kyle Hamilton. Yeah, they've got Houston.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that has to be considered as well. I don't know if Notre Dame has the cover players right now to go out there and do some of the things that North Carolina was, or that Virginia Tech was able to do to them. So it's not quite that simple, but I do appreciate the super chat very much. And I do agree that Notre Dame is the best defense that North Carolina have played this year, but it's not by a ton. I mean, Virginia Tech has a pretty good defense. Even in some of the games they've been losing recently, I don't think their defense has been necessarily the huge reason for it, and I think their defense is pretty beat up right now, but they were pretty bad against Syracuse, but they weren't the reason they lost against Pitt. They lost because they scored 7 points, so I appreciate the super chat, but Vince, this matchup is going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
And there's a obviously the scoring over here is impressive, but North Carolina scores some points. But the thing about North Carolina is that they've had a couple games that have kind of padded their overall numbers.
Agreed.
And I think that's something to consider too. Like you look at last year, North Carolina, I'm looking at their numbers. They scored 30 points or fewer 4 times last year against 26. And then I'm looking up here. They scored fewer than 27 points. They did that twice all year. One was against Notre Dame. The other was against Boston College early in the year. This year, they've scored fewer than 27 points 3 times already.
Right.
And they
The
lost all
difference
those
is,
games.
yeah, the difference is they score most of their points at home. I mean,
Right.
if you look at their
Right.
home totals, look, they 45 against Miami,
Mhm.
25 against Florida State. That's the outlier, but 38 against Duke, 59 against Virginia, 59 against Georgia
Right.
State. But they put their points up at home. On the road, they scored 10 against Virginia Tech.
Right.
They scored 22 against Georgia Tech, and those
This
are
is
their
only
only
their
two.
second road
Yeah,
game of the season because they
third.
didn't play. No,
No,
they didn't play Georgia Tech at Georgia Tech. They played in
that's right.
Atlanta.
They
So
played in
it was
Mercedes-Benz. Yeah,
technically a road game in regards to it wasn't on their home
it wasn't
field,
at
but it
home.
wasn't like
Yeah,
on another
it was a
college
neutral site.
campus,
Yeah,
which factors in my opinion.
you're right. Yeah,
Because on a neutral field, you're going to have a different
good
ticket
point.
dispersion.
Good point.
So to me, that's why I say this is their second true road game of the season, and it's not a place they've played well. So
Yeah,
I think these numbers obviously concern me. It's a
sure.
matchup that concerns me. But at the same time, I think this is still a matchup. Notre Dame has some areas where we focus on some of the areas where Notre Dame doesn't match up well against Florida State. The success of this game is going to be the areas where Notre Dame matches up well against North Carolina. I said Florida State, I meant North Carolina. And one of those is obviously, I think this year you at least have one cover player that I think you can use as a weapon. That's Cam Hart. I'm curious to see how they use Cam Hart. You're not going to have Cam Hart as your Josh Downs kryptonite because of how they use Josh Downs.
Sure.
And I don't know if I want my almost 6'3" corner matched up in space
Right.
against a 5'10" receiver that's
Right.
shifty. But what you can do is with him, you can make sure that none of the other players are going to take all over. And so I think that's a big thing for me. I think the other part of it is okay, how can you protect Clarence Lewis in this game? That's going to be a key.
Yeah.
And when we can get into all those, but at the end of the day, I still like the fact that Notre Dame can control them along the line of scrimmage. And this right here is going to be a big part of this third down matchup.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, that's red zone. I need to go down a little bit right here. Okay,
I knew where you wanted to be.
North Carolina has been a great third down offense this year. This is one area where they're actually better than they were last year. They were on third down against Virginia Tech. They had a really rough performance, went 2 of 10. And since then, they've gone 50%, 77.8% against Virginia, 42.9% against Georgia Tech, 52.9%, 53.9%, and 46.7%. They now rank 13th in the country. And I think it's Sam Howell's running ability that is a big reason for that. Not just moving the chains on third down, but at times last year where maybe he gets sacked for a 3-yard loss or plays like that, he's now kind of making people miss and running for 5 or 6 yards, which is putting them in certain positions. And I think the fact that I think this year's team at receiver has a little bit more make you miss to it than last year's team. Like De'Ami Brown, their best receiver last year, was more of a traditional receiver.
Right.
This year's receiving core has a little bit more of an RPO feel to it, in my opinion, and that's something that makes them a difficult third down matchup. So Sam Howell's running ability with the make you miss kind of players in the pass game is why I think they're a good third down offense, and they're going against a Notre Dame team that this season has been a really good third down defense.
Yeah. Yep. And it worries me though that the weapons that they have make them good on third down, right? I mean, that's what worries me about this, because we've seen Notre Dame lose contain on quarterbacks in the past. And we've seen them miss tackles. Like those are the two things that if I'm writing out keys to the game, like those are two pretty massive things that Notre Dame has to get under control in order to have success. And again, would they lose the game per se if they didn't do those two things? Maybe not.
They could.
But it's going to be a lot closer than it needs to be, and it's going to be a fourth quarter game when it doesn't need to be. And I don't want to be in a fourth quarter game with Sam Howell.
Against this offense, no.
Against this offense, yeah. I don't. No. That's not where I want to be if I'm Notre Dame. So you have to get those two things under control if you want to be successive. I
had zero concern about Keaton Slovis leading USC to a fourth quarter win last year.
Me neither. None. Zero.
I have a lot more concern about that with Sam Howell. And this is why, ultimately, this matchup right here, the things that we're talking about, because North Carolina is going to push the tempo. They're going to get the ball out quick. They're going to really come at you. And think about when we talk about the Notre Dame offense, why does that matter? It's because, you get the defense on its heels. They have trouble adjusting. Well, that's also true for Notre Dame's defense when they're going against an RPO team and a tempo team. And so it's imperative that the Notre Dame offense come out strong. So that way, if North Carolina starts off well, just like it did last year, that you can match them point for point to make sure they don't get any momentum going. Yep. Because if they get early scores and then you're not getting early scores, because I remember how last year played out. Notre Dame goes 3 and out. Ian Book scrambles around for loses 20 yards, gets sacked. Notre Dame has to punt deep from their own territory. North Carolina, I think the first possession they got was near midfield. And then, bam, just quick score. Notre Dame gets the ball back, answers. And then Carolina comes back, bam, quick score, big score again. And then Notre Dame answers. And all the excitement that the crowd had every time they scored, the crowd went, it wasn't a big crowd, but the crowd got into it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And the North Carolina sideline was fired up. And then all that went away the moment that Notre Dame responded by going back down the field and scoring.
Right.
That's going to be a big part, because I do believe that if Notre Dame can just make a stop or two early, and if the Notre Dame offense can get some points on the board early, this defense will eventually adapt to what North Carolina is doing. They'll get caught up to speed, and they'll be able to slow them down. The biggest fear is that you fall behind by 7, 10, 17 points, because this is not an offense you want to be playing catch up against. And that's the concern. So that's why the Notre Dame offense early has to have the defenses back. Now, if the defense comes out and plays great early, that's fine.
That's great.
But I'm not expecting that, because I know how this is why we've advocated for Notre Dame doing these things offensively for so long, because it's difficult.
Yes,
for a defense, especially early.
Yeah,
so
we talked about this yesterday, right? This is, to me, Notre Dame was able to the Notre Dame offense was able to put the team on their back in the last game, right?
Right.
They need to be able to do that this game, and that needs to be something that the defense can count on moving forward, especially in this North Carolina game. Maybe not against some of the other teams down the road, but especially in this game, they have to count on the offense putting some points on the board to give them a chance to take a breath. The defense that they're not. The defense has been the side of the ball that has won them games. Okay. The defense needs the offense to help them out a little bit,
like it did late against Virginia Tech.
Exactly, and like they did in the USC game, and so that's what they need. I think this offense is up to the task, and therefore I think the defense is up to the task. As long as it's not all on the defense.
Right now, right here, these three things right here, to me, for the defense, are going to determine success in this game, in my opinion. It's the ability to hold North Carolina to field goals, which is what red zone. Notre Dame's really, really good in their red zone defense when it comes to not allowing touchdowns.
Yeah.
Notre Dame has been a really good third down defense all season, and Notre Dame has been really good at forcing turnovers. Now, North Carolina is pretty good in a couple of those areas, but if Notre Dame can be in this range, be good at forcing field goals, be good at third down stops, be good at forcing turnovers, that right there, especially in the first half, is the key to success. Because the other thing we said earlier is, this isn't a team that I want to play catch up against. It's not, because they can just keep outpacing you.
Yes.
I would argue, however, that they're not a team that's necessarily built to come back incredibly well either, depending on how you defend them. Now, if you go prevent and do all that stuff like the Florida State, they'll score. But the other flip side is that when they get away, they're kind of like the opposite of Wisconsin. I've said Wisconsin's not a team that can play catch up because they just have no explosiveness. To me, when I look at North Carolina, they have a potent pass attack, but it's not a potent pass attack that scares me as much as if that's all they're doing.
Right.
What makes North Carolina so good is its balance.
You have to
now, last year, they could drop back and just beat you throwing the ball. They didn't have to, but they could. De'Ami Brown, Daz Newsome, really good group of receivers. This year, they're not that team, because if you're up 17 on them, and they have to throw the ball, say, hey, look, we're doubling Josh Downs. We're going to make you beat us with somebody else. And they don't have the weapons to do that, in my opinion. It's just like USC. You have to keep Josh Downs from having the game-changing plays. I don't care what his numbers are. Don't let them have the game-changing plays. But if you get up on them, Vince, 17, 20, because, you've made some stops, you've forced turnovers, you've got them off the field on third down. When they have put drives together, you've held them to field goals. When you're doing those things against North Carolina and they lose their ability to kind of remain balanced,
right, and
you can just pin your ears back and attack that line, knowing they're going to drop back and throw, that's where Notre Dame could really pull this, turn this sucker into I think it's going to be a tightly contested game into wow, did you see what Notre Dame did in North Carolina?
Yeah.
That's how I think.
And this is one of those games too. Even though North Carolina is 3-3, there's going to be a lot of eyeballs on this game. Number one, because
4-3, real quick, 4-3.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. I keep forgetting about last week. They're 4-3, but a lot of eyeballs are going to be on it. It's at night. It's against Sam Howell, who's really, he's one of the top quarterbacks in a low quarterback class coming out. I get that, but he's still one of the top quarterbacks. If Notre Dame can make a statement here, I think that it allows Notre Dame to finally get a little bit of respect from some people, even though North Carolina's 4-3. I get it,
because they still are a media darling.
Yeah, absolutely, no question. Even though they've laid an egg 3 times, but it doesn't matter. This is an opportunity for Notre Dame to make a statement, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about the big picture.
It has to be a blowout.
It has to be.
If Notre Dame wins by 7 to 10 points or less, they'll be because then all of a sudden North Carolina sucks, right? Oh, they're 4-4. Exactly. They're not that good. Their defense is terrible. Exactly. Blah blah blah. Right. If you rout them, that to me is a different story.
Agreed.
Because that's going to be the key. Is that? And I also think too look, this is one of the 2 teams that concerns me the most moving forward. Sure. Virginia being the other one.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you can get through this game with a W, it's like, okay, I feel a lot better about just continuing to roll. This is that stub your toe game that concerns me a little bit.
Yeah.
But if the defense plays up to its game, if the defense shines in these 3 areas, Vince, then I think it will be a fun, exciting night. Now, one thing we did not do during the show that we're going to finish with.
I was wondering about this. Go ahead.
What?
We didn't tell where our advantage is going to.
Yeah. So let's go, Vince. Here we go.
Okay.
Vincenzo.
All of the above. Yes.
Run game.
Yeah. Run game for me.
Who do you give? Let me ask you. I'm going to do it a little different this week.
Oh, okay.
Who do you give the advantage to on paper, and who do you think is going to win the matchup on Saturday night? I mean, if we're going to have it as a standalone, we can't just say, pick a team. Right?
Yeah. No, right. Okay. For me, I think on paper, as I'm looking at it right now, I think North Carolina probably has a bit of an advantage, but I think I would go with Notre Dame with the advantage just because of their front. And I think personally that Notre Dame did a little bit of looking in the mirror after last week, and I realized the way they had their defense set up, they were allowing USC to run the football. I still think there's a little bit of pride involved there, and I don't know that they're going to allow that again. And so I'm going to give Notre Dame the advantage here.
I'm going to give Notre Dame the advantage in both areas. And obviously, you look at the yards per game is almost identical. North Carolina has an advantage on yards per attempt. Notre Dame has a significant advantage in tackles for loss, and North Carolina gives up a lot of tackles for loss. I think when you look at North Carolina too, they've padded their stats again. I mean, they've played a lot of bad defenses. A lot of the teams we're talking about, how Notre Dame is playing some bad teams down the stretch. Well, a lot of those teams are teams that North Carolina has played this year. So that's why I give that advantage to Notre Dame. I think when you look at and this is a point that Matt raised earlier in regards to Virginia Tech. I would argue Virginia Tech is probably one of the best rushing defenses, if not the best rushing defense that North Carolina has played all season, and they didn't run the ball very effectively in that game. Now, of course, it was first game of the year. Then Georgia Tech, who has a bit of a salty, aggressive front, also was able to shut them down. The rest of the teams they've run on, Miami stinks on run defense. Florida State's run defense is very good.
Sure.
Duke's run defense isn't very good, and they shut North Carolina down pretty good. Virginia's run defense stinks. And Georgia State's run defense stinks. I think Notre Dame's rush defense has been pretty good ever since the opener. I mean, I still feel like that number still pads their stats a little bit because we're 7 deep. But we're talking about a team that we're kind of disappointed with the way that Notre Dame played with their rush defense last week. and they gave up 129 yards.
Yeah.
I mean, since the Florida State game, the most yards Notre Dame has given up is 129. Since the Toledo game, Notre Dame has yet to allow an opponent to rush for 4 yards a carry. You know, Purdue 2.3, Wisconsin 2.8, Cincinnati 3.1, Virginia Tech 3.4, Southern Cal 3.9. And Toledo was 4.1 with a 67-yard run.
Sure.
So I think Notre Dame's run defense has been pretty good, and it's been sneaky good. Like, we don't talk about it a lot. It's been sneaky good, really, this season. And so I give them Notre Dame the advantage in both on paper.
Okay.
And real quick, we do have a super chat from Lucas Chapman. Thank you for that, Lucas. Notre Dame's D-line should help the secondary a lot in this game, even with Hamilton being out. I can see our defense turning the ball over 3-4 times this game, and that would be a big assist for the defense. And Lucas, thank you for that super chat. We agree. And speaking of turnovers, let's get to the pass game.
Yeah.
On paper advantage, practical advantage.
Yeah, this one's tough for me just because of the absence of Kyle Hamilton, to be perfectly honest with you. And I realize that I have faith in the defensive line helping out in this category. But just going into this game, I'm giving the advantage on paper and practically to North Carolina.
I'm going to give North Carolina the advantage as well. I think the equalizer, the potential kryptonite is this one down here.
Sure.
I think if this doesn't pan out, if Notre Dame doesn't win down here, they're going to have a hard time winning all these other areas.
Sure.
I'm going to give North Carolina the advantage in both areas, but it's not by a ton. I mean, look, this number right here is a little misleading because a lot of that has to do with Notre Dame has led a lot of games. These numbers, to me, tell a greater story about the effectiveness of the Notre Dame pass defense, and that's pretty good, and it matches up somewhat effectively with these numbers over here.
Yeah.
And then this number right here and this number right here, so sacks and interceptions, if the pressure comes, the picks will come.
Right.
That's how I feel.
Right.
So even though I give North Carolina the advantage at this point in time, I'm going to have to
I could see it swinging the other way.
Right.
I might be having a different conversation if Kyle Hamilton was healthy and they had their All-American at safety, because I think that allows them to do some other things that they're not going to be able to do. They're going to be able to do some stuff, obviously, but not to the extent that they would have been if 14 was in the game. And I thought Tariq Bracy played a really good game last week. He needs to obviously build on that, and Clarence Lewis needs to have a good game. And we need to see it. And until I do, I've got to give it to the light blue.
The Tariq Bracy part of that is the interesting one, because one of two things is going to happen. I think Tariq's going to want to have a payback game.
Sure.
And so one of two things is going to happen. One, he does, right? He comes out and has a payback game. Or two, he presses so much that he makes mistakes.
Sure.
I think I got this slant timed up. I'm going to jump this slant. Oh, shoot, it was a slant and go. You know what I mean? It was a slug. Those are the concerns I have, but I'm really, because he's a good kid, and I feel bad for what happened to him last year in this game. I'd love to see him kind of get a little redemption. And he's kind of built on that interception against Virginia Tech, right? He was struggling in that game, and then he made that pick, and that was a huge moment. And then he comes out last week against USC and played really, really well. Hopefully that pick was that final, okay, I got my confidence back.
Yeah.
And because he could be a really big weapon. He's the one player Notre Dame has athletically that can hang with Josh Downs. The only one they have in the secondary that can hang with Josh Downs athletically. So if he has a big game, it'll be important.
It'll show.
So,
it'll be obvious.
And then finally, Vince, as we wrap up, scoring offense against scoring defense. Who do you give the advantage to?
This one is obviously close as I'm looking at the numbers. And I think that I honestly think that it's a big deal that this game is at Notre Dame and it's not in Chapel Hill.
I think that's factored in.
I think that's a huge deal here. And this is only the second road game, true road game, as you mentioned. They score a ton of points at home. They're comfortable at home. It's going to be another good environment at Notre Dame Stadium because it's a night game. They're going to do the light show thing. It's going to all the students are going to be back in town because there were some students that were out of town because of fall break still last week. I think it's going to be a great environment. I think North Carolina is going to struggle in that environment to score touchdowns. And I do have a lot of faith in Notre Dame's touchdown ratio in the red zone. And I think they're going to force North Carolina, number one, to field goals, but number two, to go for it on fourth down an awful lot. And I think that Notre Dame's up to the challenge. And so I think they're going to keep North Carolina out of the end zone enough to make this a game where we're not really worried about the score when it gets to the fourth quarter. So I'm going to give Notre Dame the advantage here.
I am too, because I also think this number right here is misleading. Number one, Notre Dame's offense has given up 13 points this season. I mean, directly 13 points, 2 pick sixes. And I say 13 because Virginia Tech missed the 2-point conversion attempt after the one the other week.
Right.
You take those out. The defense is now jumps up to 40th. And then when you consider the several times that Notre Dame's offense has handed, or special teams has handed opponents the ball inside the 20-yard line,
right,
that Notre Dame's red zone defense has then held the field goals, I would say that the true number for the defense as far as what they're actually giving up is higher. I think the part you brought up too is really good, is the playing at home. Because if you look at what Notre Dame has done at home this year, they gave up 22 defensive points to Toledo at home. Since then, they held Purdue to 13. Cincinnati had 24, 10 of which were on those aforementioned turnovers. And they held USC to 16, which is the lowest point total USC's had since September of 2019. And USC was a good road team. We talked about how USC had won 8 straight games on the road.
Yeah, tied for second with Notre Dame in the country.
Right. North Carolina is not a good road team. Notre Dame should have the advantage on both trenches. And Notre Dame's been pretty good on defense at home this year. And the crowd is going to be rocking. I could be completely off base here. We'll get into the scores tomorrow. But I'm with you, Vince. I think if the defense plays the way I think it's capable of, and the defensive line is allowed to be a force, and the Notre Dame coaches aren't the ones that hold it back, I do think Notre Dame's the better team. I think that their numbers are to me, I give them the advantage in this matchup. Now, on paper, it's a no-brainer. It's North Carolina. I mean, I'm sorry. If you're just looking at stats, even when you look at the context of who they played, it's North Carolina. But I think when you look at it practically and matchups and all those other kind of things, I think Notre Dame defense has the advantage of North Carolina offense. They're going to have to do it because at the end of the day, that's the only way they're going to win. Notre Dame offense has to play well, but the Notre Dame defense can't give up a ton of big plays.
They can't go up and down the field
against Florida State.
Yep.
So that's going to do it for today's show. We will be back tomorrow at 12:30. Before you leave, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Sign up for our message board, okay? We're having some great conversation on there. It's really picked up in recent weeks. And I say that every week because every week it picks up and there's more and more discussion going on. We're talking about even some things that aren't necessarily Notre Dame related, but college football related. So we're talking about that Michigan State matchup that we're going to be making a prediction for on Friday. So a lot of stuff going on at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Definitely check that out. And if you're not a message board person, but you want to support our channel, if you go to that site, it also gives you ways where you can kind of become part of the booster club, where you can support the Irish Breakdown that way also. And we don't have to split 35% of that with YouTube. So those are obviously ways that you can help us out. So hit the like, hit this notification, hit this like, okay, subscription, notification, irishbreakdown.com. And then we'll be back tomorrow at 12:30 to do our final analysis, key matchups, keys to the game, and give our predictions. And, of course, Friday we will have a mailbag as well. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Vince, thank you for joining us. And everybody have a great day. We will talk to you again very, very soon.